I knew something shady was going on when I opened my HOA statement and nearly choked on my coffee. My monthly fees had tripled overnight. No notice, no explanation. Just a bright red total that looked more like a mortgage payment than a maintenance fee. I slammed the paper down on my kitchen counter and let out a slow breath. I had dealt with plenty of bureaucratic nonsense in my life, but this was straight-up theft. Grabbed my phone and called Wilma Mathers, the HOA president, a middle-aged woman with a permanent frown and a voice like nails on a chalkboard. The kind of person who got drunk on power the moment someone handed her a clipboard. As soon as she answered, I didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Wilma, what's this nonsense about my HOA fees tripling?" Her sigh was so exaggerated, I could practically hear her rolling her eyes. "Oh, Mitchell, don't be so dramatic. The board voted to increase fees for necessary improvements." "Triple the amount, overnight, without notice," I shot back. "It was in last month's meeting minutes," she said in that condescending tone she always used when she thought she had the upper hand. "You should really keep up with community affairs." I gritted my teeth. Had been at that meeting. There had been no talk of a fee increase, let alone one that would bankrupt half the neighborhood. "And what improvements are we talking about?" I asked. "The landscaping," she said dismissively, "and we're considering a new clubhouse renovation. These things cost money, you know." I laughed dryly. "Landscaping? You mean the 2 bushes you replaced last week, and a clubhouse renovation? That place is basically a broom closet with a coffee machine." She made an indignant noise. "That's not the point, Mitchell. The board has the authority to adjust fees as needed. If you have a problem with it, you're welcome to run for a position at the next election." I hung up before I said something that would get me fined even more. Wilma had been running this HOA like her personal kingdom for years, nickel and diming homeowners for every little infraction, while conveniently approving any expense that benefited her and her little circle of cronies. But tripling the fees overnight, that was a new level of bold. I wasn't going to sit back and take it. I pulled out my laptop and started digging into the HOA's finances. I had a background in real estate law, and if there was one thing I knew better than anyone, it was how to take down corrupt organizations that thought they were untouchable. An hour later, I found exactly what I was looking for. The HOA was in serious financial trouble. Wilma and her board had been mismanaging funds for years, approving ridiculous expenses while letting real maintenance fall by the wayside. And now they were desperate. They had tripled the fees not for landscaping or renovations, but because they were on the verge of financial collapse. If they didn't come up with a massive influx of cash, they were going to default on their loans. That's when an idea formed. If Wilma wanted to play dirty, I'd show her what real power looked like. I was going to foreclose on the whole HOA complex, and when I was done, Wilma wouldn't just be out of a job, she'd be out of a home. I spent the next several hours combing through every financial document I could get my hands on. The HOA's records were a mess, disorganized, incomplete, and riddled with questionable transactions. But underneath all the sloppy bookkeeping, the truth was clear. The board was drowning in debt. A pattern emerged the deeper I went. The HOA had taken out multiple loans over the past several years, each one supposedly for improvements. But after cross-referencing their expenditures with actual work done in the community, it was obvious that most of the money had vanished into thin air. Or, more likely, into the pockets of Wilma and her cronies. One loan in particular caught my attention, a massive sum borrowed from a private lender at an interest rate so predatory it practically screamed desperation. That loan was coming due in a matter of weeks, and the HOA didn't have anywhere near the funds to cover it. That explained the sudden fee increase. Wilma wasn't fixing anything, she was scrambling to keep the whole operation from crashing down around her. I had everything I needed. By morning, I had contacted a colleague who specialized in real estate acquisitions. I explained the situation, and after a few hours of back and forth, he confirmed my suspicions. The HOA had used the community clubhouse and several common areas as collateral for their loans. That was their fatal mistake. If they defaulted, and they were about to, those assets would be up for foreclosure. And thanks to a few legal maneuvers I had up my sleeve, I could position myself to swoop in and take control before Wilma even realized what was happening. But first, I needed to set the trap. I spent the next few days gathering more evidence. I reached out to neighbors, quietly inquiring if they had noticed anything suspicious about the way the HOA was handling money. The frustration was immediate and overwhelming. People were tired of the ridiculous fees, the arbitrary fines, and the complete lack of transparency. One homeowner, an elderly man named Harold, showed me a stack of violation notices he had received for things like excessively loud wind chimes and unauthorized bird feeders. Another resident, a single mother named Lisa, revealed that she had been fined repeatedly for having a non-conforming front door color, even though she had used the exact shade listed in the HOA guidelines. It was a pattern of abuse, and now that I was paying attention, it was obvious Wilma had been running this place like her own personal kingdom for years. The final piece of the puzzle came when I discovered that Wilma had been using HOA funds to pay herself an inflated consulting fee, every month, something that was strictly against the bylaws. That was the nail in the coffin. With everything in place, I made my move. I filed the necessary paperwork with the county, positioning myself as the primary bidder for the foreclosure sale. Then, I sent a formal request to the HOA board demanding a full financial audit. Wilma's response was immediate and desperate. She called an emergency HOA meeting, trying to rally support from the other board members. Attended, sitting quietly in the back as she tried to paint me as a troublemaker. "We cannot allow one disgruntled homeowner to disrupt our community," she declared, her voice dripping with forced authority. "This is an attempt to undermine everything we've worked for." I waited until she was finished before standing up. "I think the homeowners deserve to know the truth," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Wilma, would you care to explain why the HOA is on the verge of bankruptcy?" The room fell silent. Wilma's face paled. "That's a baseless accusation." I held up a stack of documents. "These are copies of the HOA's financial records. They show years of mismanagement, unauthorized expenses, and outright fraud. Would you like me to go through them line by line?" Murmurs spread through the crowd. Wilma stammered, trying to regain control, but the damage was done. I saw the shift in the room. The residents, previously afraid to speak up, were now emboldened. I pressed on, and let's not forget the loans, the ones you took out using community property as collateral, the ones that are about to default. Gasps filled the room. A man in the front row, a retired accountant, raised his hand. "Is this true, Wilma? Did you use our community assets to secure loans without telling us?" Wilma floundered, but she had no good answer. That was when I delivered the final blow. "The foreclosure process has already begun," I announced. "And as of next week, I will own the clubhouse, the common areas, and everything else the HOA put up as collateral." A silence. Then chaos. Residents erupted in outrage, demanding answers. Wilma tried to regain control, but it was too late. The board members, sensing the inevitable, started turning on her. One even declared, "I had no idea about any of this." I watched as the entire corrupt empire crumbled before my eyes. By the time the dust settled, Wilma had resigned in disgrace. The HOA was dissolved, and the community took a vote to restructure under new leadership without arbitrary fees, without ridiculous fines, and without the corruption that had plagued it for years. And me. I walked away the owner of the very assets Wilma had gambled and lost. Justice had never tasted so sweet. With Wilma gone and the HOA dissolved, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter. People who had barely spoken before were now gathering on their lawns, sharing stories of the petty fines and ridiculous rules they had endured for years. It was like a weight had been lifted. But my work wasn't done. The assets I had acquired, the clubhouse, the common areas, and a few other parcels the HOA had put up as collateral needed to be handled carefully. I wasn't about to turn into another dictator running things from the top down. If this neighborhood was going to function without an oppressive HOA, it needed a structure that actually benefited the homeowners. I held a meeting at the clubhouse, now officially mine, and invited every resident. The turnout was overwhelming. People were eager to see what would come next. Some had concerns, others just curiosity, but everyone wanted to be part of the conversation. That alone was a good sign. I laid out my plan. The clubhouse and common areas would remain open to the community, but instead of mandatory fees, access would be based on voluntary contributions. I wasn't looking to profit off my neighbors. I just wanted to ensure that the property was maintained without the financial manipulation the previous board had relied on. A few people were skeptical at first, but once I showed them the actual numbers, what it really cost to keep things running versus the bloated budgets Wilma had pushed, they realized how much they had been overpaying. The voluntary approach wasn't just fair, it was sustainable. Then came the real challenge, dealing with the debts the HOA had left behind. Even though the entity itself was dissolved, some financial obligations remained. I had to work with legal experts to ensure homeowners weren't unfairly saddled with past mismanagement. It wasn't easy, but piece by piece, I dismantled what remained of Wilma's disastrous reign. Meanwhile, the former board members scattered. Some tried to play innocent, claiming they had been unaware of the financial mess, but the homeowners weren't buying it. Wilma, on the other hand, had vanished almost overnight. I later heard she had moved to another state, likely to escape the growing number of legal inquiries into her handling of HOA funds. As for the neighborhood, something amazing happened. Without the arbitrary rules and constant threats of fines, people started taking real pride in their homes. Yards were maintained not because of fear, but because people actually wanted their community to look nice. Neighbors helped each other with repairs, kids played in the streets without worrying about noise violations, and the oppressive atmosphere of the HOA was replaced with genuine cooperation. One evening, as I walked through the neighborhood, Lisa, the single mother who had been constantly fined for the color of her front door, came up to me with a smile. She told me how much things had changed for her, how she no longer felt like she was walking on eggshells in her own home. That's when I knew we had done the right thing. The HOA had tried to control us through fear and greed, but in the end, their own corruption had destroyed them. And in their place, we built something better, not just a neighborhood, but a community. With Wilma gone and the HOA buried beneath its own corruption, I finally had room to breathe. But that didn't mean everything was smooth sailing. The aftermath of dismantling an organization that had ruled through intimidation for years left a void, and people weren't entirely sure what came next. Some were excited, others cautious. Change, even when good, unsettled people. The first major challenge came when a handful of former board members tried to stir up trouble. They hadn't been the worst offenders like Wilma, but they'd been complicit, either through silence or passive approval of her schemes. Now that she was gone, they saw an opportunity to reclaim some control. One evening, I received a letter slipped under my door. No return address, no signature, just a typed message demanding an emergency community leadership meeting. They framed it as necessary for neighborhood stability, but I knew exactly what it was, a power grab. I wasn't about to let them resurrect the HOA under a different name. Instead of playing into their hands, I called my own meeting. This time, I made sure it was open to every homeowner, not just a select few. When the former board members arrived, they looked irritated, clearly expecting a closed-door discussion where they could quietly maneuver their way back into authority. They didn't get that chance. I laid out the facts for everyone. There was no longer an HOA monopoly dictating how things worked, and that meant decisions needed to be made collectively. No more secret meetings, no more backroom deals. If something needed to be done, whether it was maintaining shared spaces or setting up a neighborhood watch, it would be handled transparently. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People were tired of being treated like tenants instead of homeowners. They wanted a voice in what happened to their own community. The former board members were visibly frustrated, but they couldn't argue against a room full of people who had been burned by the old system. One by one, they realized their influence had evaporated. Without the HOA's blanket authority to back them up, they had no leverage. That was the moment I knew the neighborhood had truly changed. Still, there were logistical issues to work out. The clubhouse and shared spaces needed upkeep, and while I had no intention of profiting off them, I also wasn't going to shoulder the costs alone. I proposed a straightforward solution: voluntary contributions. People could pitch in as much or as little as they wanted, and in return, the community would stay functional without the excessive fees and fines. To my surprise, people jumped at the idea. Without the fear of arbitrary penalties, homeowners were more than willing to contribute fairly. Some even offered to handle maintenance themselves, mowing the grass, repairing minor damages, keeping things clean. It was the kind of cooperation that had been impossible under the HOA's rule. The biggest surprise, however, came a few weeks later. A group of homeowners approached me with an offer. They wanted to buy the clubhouse and common areas outright, not to control them, but to ensure they remained community-owned forever. They had pooled their resources, offering a fair price that covered the remaining costs from the HOA's financial mess. I didn't hesitate. Selling the property back to the homeowners was the final step in severing the last ties to the corrupt system Wilma had created. No single person would control these spaces again. They belonged to the people who lived here, just as they always should have. As I signed over the deeds, I realized something. This wasn't just about fighting back against an abusive HOA. It was about reclaiming autonomy. People had been conditioned to believe they needed an authoritarian body micromanaging their lives, but now they saw the truth. They were more than capable of managing their own community without fear-driven regulations or power-hungry enforcers. In the following months, the changes became even more apparent. Without the HOA breathing down their necks, homeowners started making improvements to their properties not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. The neighborhood flourished, not because of threats and fines, but because people finally had a reason to take pride in their homes. And as for me, I had never planned to become the person who brought down an entire HOA, but I wasn't complaining. Wilma had thought she could squeeze the community dry, that she could manipulate rules and finances without consequence. She had underestimated the people she was trying to control. And in the end, that was her downfall. With the last ties to the HOA severed and the neighborhood thriving under its newfound independence, I thought things would finally settle down. But just as I was getting comfortable, a new problem surfaced, one I hadn't anticipated. It started with quiet whispers among some of the homeowners. At first, I didn't pay much attention. People were still adjusting to life without an HOA, and rumors tended to spread when there was uncertainty. But when I noticed a few of the former board members slinking around, having hushed conversations with certain residents, I knew something was up. I decided to investigate. Over the next few days, I kept an eye on the usual suspects, the ones who had supported Wilma's reign but had been too cowardly to go down with her. They weren't just chatting about neighborhood issues, they were actively trying to stir up discontent. Then got my answer. A neighbor named Greg, a retired contractor who had lived here for over 20 years, approached me one evening. He was never one to involve himself in drama, so when he showed up on my doorstep, I knew he had something important to say. He wasted no time laying it out. A faction of homeowners, led by a few of the old board members, was trying to push for a new HOA. They were preying on the uncertainty of some residents, claiming that without an official governing body, property values would plummet, crime would increase, and chaos would take over. It was nonsense, of course. The neighborhood was better off than it had ever been, but fear was a powerful tool, and they were using it well. Greg wasn't the only one concerned. Over the next week, more people came forward, frustrated that these troublemakers wouldn't let things be. I knew I had to act before things spiraled out of control. I started by gathering solid evidence. I recorded conversations, collected testimonies, and even had a few residents forward me emails they had received from the pro-HOA faction. Their tactics were underhanded, subtle threats about how those who didn't support the new HOA would be left behind when order was restored. I wasn't about to let them rebuild the same corrupt system we had just destroyed. I called for a neighborhood assembly, making sure every homeowner was invited. Unlike the secretive meetings Wilma and her cronies used to hold, this would be completely transparent. If they wanted to push for an HOA, they would have to do it in front of everyone. The turnout was even larger than I expected. People were anxious, some angry, others just confused about what was happening. The former board members arrived, clearly ready for a fight. They had likely expected to control the narrative before I got involved. Once everyone settled, I took the floor. I laid out the facts, showing them the emails, the conversations, and the manipulative tactics being used to scare people into submission. I didn't rely on emotion, I let the evidence speak for itself. Then I opened the floor for discussion. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Homeowners, especially those who had suffered under the old HOA, were furious. They called out the former board members, demanding to know why they were trying to bring back something that had only ever caused problems. One of them, a man named Richard, tried to defend himself, claiming they were only looking out for the best interests of the community. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Someone reminded him how he had once fined an elderly couple for having the wrong type of mailbox. Another neighbor recounted the time he had threatened to tow cars from driveways because they were too close to the sidewalk. The tide turned fast. Seeing they were losing control of the situation, Richard and his supporters tried to claim that an HOA was inevitable, that it was the only way to maintain order. That's when I dropped my final piece of evidence. Using public records, I had discovered that this group wasn't just pushing for an HOA, they were planning to install themselves as the new board members, with full control over finances and rule-making. They had already drafted bylaws that would give them the power to impose fees and fines without homeowner approval. It wasn't about protecting the community, it was about power, again. The room erupted. Homeowners who had been unsure before were now firmly against the idea. The last remnants of the old regime had been exposed for what they were: opportunists trying to reclaim authority they had lost. By the end of the meeting, any chance of a new HOA forming had been crushed. The former board members, realizing they had been outmaneuvered, left in disgrace. Some even put their homes up for sale within the following weeks, unwilling to live in a community they couldn't control. With that final threat neutralized, the neighborhood truly became what it was meant to be: a place where people work together, not under the rule of a corrupt few. And as I stood on my porch that evening, Watching kids play in the street without fear of fines, I knew we had won. For good. With the last remnants of the HOA's influence wiped out, the neighborhood finally found its rhythm. People had learned firsthand that they didn't need a board of self-important bureaucrats dictating how they lived. The voluntary system I had helped put in place was working. The common areas were maintained, people contributed fairly, and most importantly, no one lived in fear of arbitrary fines or power-hungry enforcers. However, just because the HOA itself was gone didn't mean its past mistakes had disappeared. There were still lingering issues, contracts the HOA had signed, debts they had left behind, and legal loose ends that needed tying up. I wasn't about to let those come back to bite us. I started by digging deeper into the financial mess Wilma had left behind. While I had taken control of the clubhouse and common areas, there were still unpaid vendors and disputed contracts that hadn't been properly handled. Some of these companies had been overcharging the HOA for years, relying on Wilma's incompetence to get away with it. Now that the HOA was dead, they were trying to squeeze homeowners directly for payments on work that had never been completed. That wasn't going to fly. I spent weeks gathering every piece of documentation could find. Some homeowners still had copies of old HOA letters and invoices. Others had saved emails from Wilma and the board. It quickly became clear that these vendors had been in on the scam, charging for services they never fully rendered, inflating costs and pocketing the difference. Armed with evidence, I paid a visit to the largest offender, a property management company that had been draining the HOA's accounts for years. They had sent notices to several homeowners, claiming they were owed money for ongoing maintenance agreements. These agreements had never been approved by homeowners, only by Wilma and her corrupt circle. I walked into their office with a thick folder of documents. The receptionist, clearly used to dealing with frustrated homeowners, barely looked up before waving me toward a waiting area. But I wasn't here to wait. I walked straight past her desk and into the office of the company's director, a slick-looking man in a tailored suit who clearly wasn't expecting me. He barely had time to feign surprise before I dropped the folder onto his desk. I laid it out for him, the fraudulent invoices, the inflated charges, the payments for work that had never been completed. Then I made it clear. He had two choices. Either he wiped every single outstanding claim he had against homeowners, or I would take everything to the state attorney general's office and file a formal complaint for fraudulent business practices. He tried to argue, but he knew he was caught. Within an hour, I had signed statements from his company releasing all claims against the homeowners. Another piece of Wilma's corruption was erased. With that out of the way, I focused on cleaning up the legal framework around the community itself. The land parcels, had taken over through the foreclosure process, still needed proper documentation to ensure no one could ever use them to reinstate an HOA. Worked with a real estate attorney to legally designate them as community property, owned collectively by the homeowners through a trust. This meant that no single person, not even me, could ever sell them or leverage them for finance. The final step was ensuring that no remnants of the HOA's legal authority remained. Even though we had dissolved it, some clauses in property deeds still referenced the old governing body. I arranged for a legal amendment to be filed with the county, officially removing all HOA-related restrictions from the neighborhood's records. It was done. For the first time in years, the community was truly free. No HOA, no lingering debts, no hidden contracts waiting to drag homeowners back into a cycle of corruption. As months passed, the transformation became even more apparent. Without the constant fear of fines and arbitrary rules, people started investing in their homes in ways they never had before. Yards were well kept, not because of regulations, but because people actually wanted to take pride in their properties. Neighbors helped each other out, organizing small projects to keep shared spaces looking good. The change was undeniable. Without an HOA breathing down their necks, people worked together. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, Lisa, the single mother who had been constantly harassed under Wilma's reign, walked up with her young son. She handed me a small envelope, looking a little embarrassed but determined. Inside was a handwritten note from several homeowners, thanking me for everything I had done. Along with it was a gift card to a local steakhouse, something they had all chipped in for. I wasn't the sentimental type, but I had to admit it felt good. I had never set out to be the person who took down an entire HOA, but I had done it. Not just for myself, but for everyone who had been trapped under its control. And as I looked around the neighborhood, the kids playing in the street, the families enjoying their homes without fear, I knew one thing for certain. Wilma and her corrupt crew had tried to control us, to bleed us dry with their greed and power plays. But in the end, they had lost everything. And we had won our freedom.